Imagine a company so powerful it could declare war. Not a country, not a king, a company. It had its own army, its own navy, its own courts. It could execute criminals, mint coins, and sign treaties with foreign governments, and answer to almost no one. At its peak, this single corporation controlled more than half of the world's trade. It commanded 150 merchant ships, 40 warships, and over 50,000 employees spread across 4 continents. It wasn't a government, it wasn't an empire. It was a business, and it changed the world in ways we are still living with today. I'm Copper Fox. Let's get into the details. The year is 1500. Europe has a spice addiction. Not the metaphorical kind, a literal, all-consuming, economy-shaping obsession with nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, and pepper. These weren't just flavors. In an era before refrigeration, spices were the difference between edible food and rotting meat. They were medicine. They were status symbols. A bag of nutmeg was worth more than a house in Amsterdam. Pepper was so valuable it was used to pay rent. And all of it, every last clove, every grain of pepper, came from one place. The Spice Islands, what we now call Indonesia. A tiny cluster of volcanic islands sitting roughly 12,000 miles from the coast of Europe. Getting there was the problem. The journey was brutal. Ships disappeared constantly. Lost to storms, disease, pirates, or just the sheer uncertainty of navigating waters no European had ever properly mapped. A round trip could take 2 to 3 years, and the cost of outfitting a single ship was staggering. Crew, provisions, cannons, cargo holds, repairs. It demanded a fortune before a single ounce of spice ever touched the dock. For decades, merchants funded these voyages the old way. A small group of wealthy investors would pool their money for one trip. If the ship came back, they split the profit. If it didn't, which happened far more often than anyone liked to admit, everyone lost everything. This model had a fundamental flaw. The risk was too concentrated. The capital required was too large, and by the late 1500s, dozens of competing Dutch trading companies were undercutting each other so aggressively that even successful voyages barely turned a profit. Something had to change. In 1602, the Dutch government did something that had never been done before in the history of commerce. They forced all competing Dutch spice trading companies to merge. Not just merge, they created a single unified entity with a legal structure the world had never seen. They called it the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. And to fund it, they opened it to the public. For the first time in history, anyone could buy a piece of this company. Not a loan, not a favor owed to a wealthy patron. An actual ownership stake, a share, that would pay dividends when the company made money. They built a dedicated exchange in Amsterdam specifically to handle the buying and selling of these shares. The world's first stock exchange, and within its first year, the VOC raised over 6 million guilders from thousands of ordinary citizens, merchants, craftsmen, widows with modest savings, all betting on ships they would never see. Spreading risk across thousands of investors instead of concentrating it among a handful of backers unlocked a level of capital that no single merchant, no single king had ever been able to mobilize before. I've moved a lot of money across a lot of centuries, but I had never seen anything like this. It was the moment money stopped being a tool and started being a machine. The modern financial system was born in an Amsterdam counting house, funded by the savings of ordinary people who just wanted a return on their investment. But the Dutch government didn't just give the VOC money, they gave it power. The VOC received a 21-year monopoly on all Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Strait of Magellan, essentially the entire known trading world outside Europe and the Americas. That was the beginning. On top of the monopoly, the VOC was also granted the right to build forts, maintain armies, wage wars, execute criminals, negotiate treaties with foreign rulers, and establish colonies. On paper, it was a trading company. In practice, it was a sovereign state. The VOC moved fast. Within a decade, it had established its headquarters in Batavia, what is now Jakarta, Indonesia. It forced local rulers into one-sided trade agreements. It blockaded ports. It destroyed competitors, sometimes literally, burning rivals' spice crops to maintain price control across the entire market. The Banda Islands became the defining example of what the VOC was capable of. Banda was the only place on Earth where nutmeg grew naturally, and the local population had an intolerable habit. They sold to multiple buyers, including the English and Portuguese, rather than accepting the VOC's fixed prices. The VOC's response was systematic. Under Governor General John Peterson Cohen, the islands were invaded. The Banda population, estimated at around 15,000 people, was reduced to roughly 1,000 survivors through massacre, starvation, and enslavement. Nutmeg production was transferred to Dutch colonists who used slave labor to harvest it. The VOC now held a complete monopoly on the world's most valuable spice, and it had demonstrated exactly how far it would go to maintain it. At its peak in the mid-1600s, the VOC was operating at a scale that resists easy comparison. More than 150 merchant vessels, 40 warships, a private army numbering in the tens of thousands, fortified trading posts stretching from West Africa to Japan, a network spanning 4 continents. The company's charter generated dividends that, in some years, exceeded 40%. Early investors became extraordinarily wealthy. VOC stock became a subject of public obsession in Amsterdam in ways that sound strikingly familiar today. Price swings, speculation, people mortgaging their homes to buy in, and the financial innovations kept coming. The Dutch invented the concept of short selling, betting that a stock's price would fall. They invented commodity futures, options contracts, credit instruments that let merchants borrow against cargo that hadn't even arrived yet. The entire infrastructure of modern capital markets developed in Amsterdam around the VOC over roughly 1 century. The company itself became a template. The English copied it with their own East India Company. The French tried it. The concept of a joint stock corporation, where investors risk only what they contribute, nothing more, became the legal foundation of every major business that exists today. Every company you've ever worked for, invested in, or bought a product from traces its legal DNA back to that building in Amsterdam in 1602. But the VOC's strength was also its undoing. An operation that enormous, spread across 4 continents, staffed by tens of thousands of employees working thousands of miles from any oversight, was almost impossible to manage honestly. Corruption became endemic. VOC employees ran private trading operations on the side, using company ships and resources for personal profit. Governors enriched themselves while the books stayed quiet. The dividend payments, a point of pride for over a century, were quietly being funded not by profits, but by debt. Meanwhile, the British East India Company had been learning, adapting, and competing for a century and a half. By the mid-1700s, it was winning. The VOC's monopoly became increasingly difficult to enforce. Piracy cut into revenues. Wars drained reserves. The company was paying out dividends it had not earned, papering over losses with borrowed capital. By the late 1700s, the VOC was functionally insolvent, a ghost of its former power kept alive by institutional inertia and the illusion that something this large could not simply collapse. On December 31st, 1799, the charter of the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie was allowed to expire. Its debts, exceeding 100 million guilders, were absorbed by the Dutch government. Its territories became Dutch colonial possessions. The world's first multinational corporation quietly went out of business. What the VOC left behind wasn't spices or colonies or warships. It was a structure, the idea that you could pool the resources of thousands of ordinary people, organize them under a legal entity, and direct them towards something too large and too risky for any individual to attempt alone. That idea survived. It evolved. It spread to every economy on Earth. The company is gone. The template is everywhere. And if you think controlling half the world's trade sounds impressive, next time we're talking about a family that didn't control trade. They controlled something far more powerful. They controlled the money behind the trade, the loans that funded wars, the credit lines that kept governments alive, the family that quietly ran Europe's financial system, and how they built that power from nothing. That's next on Copper Fox.